Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, episode 73 Napoleon's Triumph. In the last episode on the siege of Toulon, we saw the great Mediterranean port encircled by the Republic's armies. Heavily outnumbered and practically abandoned by Europe, the defenders of Toulon somehow held the line. But that was about to change. With Napoleon leading the artillery and future marshals leading the troops, victory would finally be achieved. However, as we witness this great triumph of Napoleon's career, we will also see events that are far less admirable, from mass executions of civilians to inexplicable and deadly blunders. The end of this campaign has no shortage of controversies. It's for that reason that we will explore them further in not one, not two, but 3 episode extras. Yes, the madness of Toulon is endlessly fascinating, and I did have to stop myself from creating a 6th episode. Instead, the conclusion of this mighty siege will be accompanied by an episode's worth of bonus content, so make sure not to miss it. Of course, this is the time where I quickly remind you that I need your help to keep Grey History on the air. Like the Young Republic, this revolution is besieged by external forces, and counter-revolutionaries are everywhere. It's only with the support of the amazing community that I can continue to bring you the history podcast you've come to love. So, if you want to see the Reign of Terror, if you want to see the fall of Robespierre, if you want to see Napoleon's return in Italy and beyond, then I need your help. Supporting the show lets you enjoy hours of bonus content and an ad-free feed, and a whole host of other benefits, including early access for those on the True Revolutionary tier. Furthermore, as you hear the twists and turns of Paris, you can smile and bask in the great feeling that you're doing your part to help produce independent history that isn't black and white. So support the revolution today and become a member of the Grey History community by donating the equivalent of half a cup of coffee when main narrative episodes are released. There's links in the show notes and on the website. Now, some brief news from Revolutionary Headquarters. The next live video seminar for the members of the show will be on Saturday the 20th of July. We'll be talking about all things Federalist revolts and the Siege of Toulon, and with several custom maps created for this occasion, I can assure you it will be an absolutely great time. We'll not only discuss more aspects and controversies of the revolts, but it will provide you the opportunity to ask me questions on the fly as well as share your own thoughts. Now, just like last time, this will be for members on the True Revolutionary tier and above, and please do RSVP. If you're interested, more information can be found on patreon.com alongside the recent video update explaining what's coming up for the rest of the year. That update can in fact be watched by everybody, so if you're interested in what's in store for 2024, do check it out. There's links in the show notes, or just visit patreon.com/Grey History. Speaking of Patreon, it's time to introduce the newest, awesomest people on the planet. A huge welcome to the newest virtuous citizens: Monica, Will, Jeremy, Julia, Grant, Patrick, Citizen Stefan, Shane, Michael T, Lewis, Paul, Michael H, Kerry, and Stefan. Another warm welcome to the newest True Revolutionaries: Jay, Diane, Leon, James, and Daniel. A special shout out to those citizens who have increased their pledge and become True Revolutionaries: the amazing Nathan, Russell, and Sophia. Of course, this is a revolution, and as we all know, revolutions need champions. So a huge thank you to the amazing champions of the people: Cindy, George, Mark, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Kevin, Carl, Jeff, Ritas, Hannah, Tyrone, Jen, Cameron, and Brett. Finally, one ginormous thank you to the ginormously generous heroes of the Revolution: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Auger, Kevin, Scott, Howard, Fernando, Hilberto, and Ron. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into this final episode on the Federalist revolts. Let's get into Napoleon's triumph. Setbacks. If one was to choose a single word to define the first month of the Toulon campaign, setbacks seems an appropriate choice. For both the besieger and the besieged, things had simply not gone to plan. If we start with the French, their failures had been multiple. First and foremost was the disastrous command of General Carteau. In the fourth week of the campaign, the French had secured the small settlement of La Seine on the western shores of the inner harbour. This was a success, to be sure, but what followed was an appalling blunder. Ultimately, La Seine was irrelevant. What truly mattered were the nearby forts of Balaguer and L'Aiglette. Guarding the entrance to the inner harbour, these were the keys to unlocking the town's defence. Yet here, Carteau missed his chance. Instead of snatching Mount Cairo and the fortifications beyond, the sluggishness of the French had allowed the Allies to do so first. Worse still, Carteau had then permitted his enemies to fortify the heights, an inexcusable mistake which infuriated the general's detractors. Much to the horror of Napoleon Bonaparte, the British had soon constructed a makeshift fortification, known to its occupants as Fort Mulgrave. In a worrying omen for the Republicans, the French called it Little Gibraltar. However, for all the setbacks of Carteau to the town's west, his comrades to the east fared no better. On the opposite side of Toulon, Major General Lapoppe had dared to dream. In a daring manoeuvre, the ambitious officer attempted to seize Mount Ferron on the 1st of October. In a stunning series of events, the French had initially succeeded, dislodging the defenders and even securing some of the mountain's fortifications. This victory was somehow both total and temporary. Doomed to failure by the loss of the heights, the town's defenders orchestrated what some historians praise as a brilliant counterattack. As the Republicans retreated in disarray, bodies tumbled down the steep ravines, and so too did the prospect of a quick French victory. To add insult to injury, on the very same day, the rebels of Toulon finally lowered the tricolour flag and replaced it with the white banner of the monarchy. But, for all the misfortunes of their opponents, setbacks would appropriately describe the situation for Toulon's defenders. The absence of significant manpower had always constrained Allied manoeuvrability, and the French seizure of the western town of Oulu on September 7 had effectively penned the Allies in Toulon. For all the talk of marching to Marseille and beyond, the defenders were stationary, desperate for much-needed support. Here, the faults of the First Coalition were festering. Hope would be met with silence. So, by mid-October, the two sides had seen sporadic combat with mixed results. The French had tried, and failed, to land knockout blows, while the Allies found themselves defending a position which was hardly ideal. For the next month, from mid-October to mid-November, A sort of stalemate settled on the siege. In the interim, both sides sought the advantage, but only one had success. For the French, events elsewhere produced favourable results. Most importantly, in early October, the siege of Lyon came to an end. The subjugation of the nation's second largest city was crucial. Henceforth, both men and supplies could stream towards Toulon, bolstering French forces with thousands of experienced troops. This alone was a godsend for the Republican cause, but the good news kept coming. On the nearby Italian front, the planned offensives by Piedmont Sardinia proved disastrous. Despite the considerable distractions of Lyon and Toulon, French armies had secured tremendous victories in both Savoy and Nice. With winter threatening to close the Alpine passes back to northern Italy, further offensives were effectively checked for the year. Consequently, yet more troops could be redeployed to Toulon. But it wasn't just an influx of manpower which aided the Republican cause. Denounced for his earlier failings, General Carteau was eventually replaced as the commander of the besieging force. Initially, the painter was substituted for a doctor named Dupuy. Yes, you heard me right. Dupuy was a physician, and like Carteau, his appointment owed more to political reliability than military prowess. However, despite his inexperience, Dupuy almost seized Toulon in mid-November. What occurred on the 15th of November is a matter of dispute. Generally, the story goes that a French battalion was enraged by seeing Spaniards mistreating French prisoners of war. The French rushed to their comrades' defence, with this disorganised assault occurring at an outpost of the newly constructed Fort Mulgrave. According to some accounts, this unexpected skirmish proved to be a golden opportunity to seize the fort, and thus win the siege. After all, should Little Gibraltar fall, then the harbour fortifications behind it would be next. With these, the French would control the harbour, and with them, Toulon. However, while this may have been a great opportunity, the French failed to seize it. Why this occurred is controversial. As the battle raged, the Allies found themselves in a precarious position. No one had expected an attack in broad daylight, and so it took time for the defenders to ferry troops across the harbour to the isolated forts on the western side. Seeing his enemy outnumbered, it's alleged that Napoleon begged Dupuy to commit to the fray. Dupuy declined. Ultimately, the Allies reinforced Fort Mulgrave and the initiative was lost. Yet again, the French missed their chance. In response to another setback, some contemporaries and historians blame this reversal on Dupuy's inexperience. Others, including Napoleon, allege that the death of an aide-de-camp had terrified Dupuy and dissuaded him from taking aggressive actions. Whatever the case, it should be noted that this whole affair is drenched in disputes. For example, some scholars claim that this impromptu attack was actually a planned assault, and its instigation had nothing to do with the alleged mistreatment of French prisoners. In bolstering their case, they point to diversionary attacks on other fortifications as evidence that this skirmish was planned and intentional. Irrelevant of the precise details, I suspect Napoleon found himself pondering a simple question. How is it that he managed to trade incompetence for inexperience? The Toulon campaign was approaching the 3-month mark, and French efforts remained hamstrung by ineptitude. Luckily for Napoleon, help was on the way. Dupuy was quickly replaced by Major General Dugommier. an officer both competent and experienced. In Dugommiers' arrival, the French had secured a second major advantage. A veteran of the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War, Dugommier had an unusual background. An aristocrat and a plantation owner, Dugommier was nonetheless a firm supporter of the revolutionary movement. Consequently, Dugommier had been sent to France to represent the interests of the revolution's supporters in the French Caribbean, and while back in Europe, he had re-enlisted in the army. Now in his mid-50s, the arrival of Dugommier would be a boon for the French, and Napoleon in particular. With men, supplies, and good leadership finally arriving en masse, the French found themselves in an increasingly favourable position. But, for all the positive developments, we shouldn't overegg it. The situation for the Republicans was by no means ideal. Two factors compelled a prompt and immediate victory. Failure to do otherwise would be costly. The first factor compelling a quick resolution was the difficulty in obtaining sufficient supplies of food. After months of war, revolts, and a British blockade, the south of France was on the brink of starvation. On the 13th of November, just days before Dugommier's arrival, the representative on mission, Ferron, begged his colleagues for additional supplies. We are always on the verge of collapse. All the corn of the former Provence is exhausted. The armies devour it. You must send corn in all haste from all the departments where the harvest has been good. You know how hunger favours the hopes of our enemies. Weeks later, on the 2nd of December, another representative implored the Committee of Public Safety to send grain. The departments of the South are at their last resort. We hide as much as we can this terrible truth. So, time was of the essence, but not just for the want of food. The second factor compelling a prompt end to the siege was more personal, at least for the army's leaders. Come December, the terror was in full swing. So too was the guillotine. For aristocratic officers with lackluster results, these were dangerous times. For Dugommier in particular, an inability to secure Toulon could very well be fatal. Just in case this wasn't already evident, the Committee of Public Safety made it clear. You will take Toulon, or you will merit our regrets. Thus, while late October and early November had generally been advantageous for the French, the situation was by no means perfect. A well-entrenched enemy was far from the only danger, and food shortages and political risk haunted the Republican effort. Nonetheless, it can at least be said that these few weeks were net positive. Their opponents could not say the same. Despite some considerable success in the opening stages of the campaign, by mid-November the Allies found themselves increasingly desperate. Since occupying Toulon some 11 weeks prior, their difficulties had only grown. First and foremost was the inability to secure sufficient troops. While the arrival of some reinforcements had bolstered the defence, these piecemeal detachments were nothing compared to the French forces which were now advancing with haste. Furthermore, they also paled in comparison to the support Vice Admiral Hood had anticipated when he first seized Toulon. Hood had gambled that Europe would support him, but as each day passed, his odds looked increasingly slim. Rumours swirled that thousands of Austrians, Hessians, and British might arrive at any moment. And yet, they did not. For all the talk of salvation, the horizon remained painfully empty. Compounding the problem was the situation on the ground. What good troops the Allies had were stretched to capacity, and sickness soon crippled their strength. By the end of October, perhaps 25% of the town's defenders were simply too sick to fight. Combined with their own difficulties in securing appropriate rations, the siege was taking a miserable toll. Yet, lack of men and supplies weren't the only problems. So too was a lack of unity. In multiple ways, Toulon's defenders were increasingly fractured. Tensions began to flare between the British and the Spanish as the prospects of the siege evidently soured. Since August, Britain had been the dominant partner, but the Spanish had begun to ask why. After all, Spanish forces were 3 times greater than the meagre British contingent. In fact, thanks to the various activities of the British fleet, Spain was occasionally the dominant naval power as well. So, Madrid protested continued British leadership, and as its officers in Toulon negotiated with Vice Admiral Hood, the situation became extremely tense. At one point, Spanish officers even maneuvered ships of the line to threaten a broadside of the HMS Victory. Thankfully, common sense prevailed, but these aggressive negotiations underline an important point. Tensions between the Allies were escalating, just as the French were finally resolving their own leadership deficiencies. Further complications were soon to follow. Relations between the Allies and the residents of Toulon were also souring with speed. Neither side trusted the other, and grievances began to flare. As food ran short and victory seemed doubtful, measures were taken to ensure Toulon's compliance. As discussed in the episode extra for the last episode, émigré volunteers and the Comte de Provence, then the regent for King Louis XVII, and himself the future King Louis XVIII, were explicitly barred from entering Toulon in order to keep the peace. This angered Toulon's sectional authorities, who were eager to see the return of the French prince. But later measures were even more contentious. By the final weeks of the siege, Toulon's National Guards were forcibly disarmed, and French troops were withdrawn from strategic fortifications. Furthermore, the sale of weapons was forbidden, as were gatherings, and movement within the town was subject to increased surveillance. None of these measures had been approved by the sectional authorities, nor had unilateral changes to their original terms of surrender. In short, the partnership between Toulon and its saviours had given way to an unapologetic occupation. So, by the time Dugommier arrived at Toulon in mid-November, the fortunes of both sides were diverging. The French still had considerable issues, most notably the supply of food, but the influx of men, munitions, and quality leadership were an undeniable boon. For the Allies, time had been less kind. Although reinforcements had trickled in, substantial aid was not forthcoming, and sickness and shortages sapped both morale and strength. Having arrived at the siege, Dugommier immediately threw his support behind an audacious plan. Before we discuss it, a quick reminder that there are links to maps in the show notes, on the website, and on social media. At a council of war on the 25th of November, Major General Dugommier detailed his proposal. Consisting of 5 points, the plan aligned closely with what Napoleon had been advocating for months. Firstly, the French would storm Fort Mulgrave, the new redoubt on the heights of Mount Cairo. If the so-called Little Gibraltar was taken, the siege was as good as won, as the French would swiftly control the entrance to the inner harbour. Secondly, the Republicans would simultaneously launch diversionary bombardments against Fort Malbousquet. Fort Malbousquet was the fort immediately to the west of Toulon, strategically positioned to prevent a direct thrust against the township. Here, the objective was not to seize Malbousquet, but rather feint an attempt to do so. As the loss of Malbousquet would also be fatal, the Allies would be forced to respond. The resulting diversion of precious men and supplies would facilitate the capture of the true target, Little Gibraltar. Now, while these measures would be undertaken by the French forces west of Toulon, those to Toulon's east would not miss the party. Like the western flank, French forces east of the town would launch one genuine assault accompanied by a diversionary bombardment. In the third element of de Gaumier's plan, another attempt would be made on Mount Ferron. Should the mountain fall, hell would rain on Toulon. Furthermore, an outlying position named Cape Bras would be the target of a misleading cannonade. As Cape Bras overlooked the outer harbour, the Allies would be forced to protect it. Thus, the strategic brilliance of this plan was that the capture of any one of these four positions would be extremely advantageous to the French. Consequently, the Allies would have no choice but to defend each part, despite their thinly stretched forces. By now, it can be said that Toulon's defence resembled a chain, and the rupture of just a single link would be fatal. However, I said that de Gaumier's plan consisted of 5 components, and yet only 4 have been named. So, what's the missing part? The 5th and final element of de Gaumier's proposal was that long-range artillery would be positioned to bombard Toulon itself. This would demoralize and distract the enemy, as the French attacked key positions to Toulon's west, north, and east. But this component, and indeed all of the components, relied on one thing: artillery. As a result, this whole operation relied on Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, it's been a while since we last checked in with Napoleon in the first months of the siege. Back in September, Napoleon had hastily constructed 2 batteries on the western reaches of the inner harbour. These were called de la Montagne and Sans-Culottes. While artillery duels followed with a small subset of the Allied fleet, these isolated positions were quickly obsolete. But throughout both October and November, Napoleon had kept busy. By the start of December, 10 batteries had been completed, with more on the way. Critically, the construction of these batteries had been a grueling affair. In particular, the establishment of 3 positions near Fort Mulgrave proved especially difficult. In some instances, the French were constructing batteries less than 300 metres or 1,000 feet from enemy lines. Consequently, Allied artillery terrorised the French. Hell rained upon Napoleon's men, and his troops quickly equated construction efforts to a suicide mission. Exposed to this ceaseless bombardment, their unease is entirely understandable. But it's not for nothing that Napoleon has a reputation as an officer who could inspire his troops. Seeing morale plunge to new depths, Napoleon rallied his soldiers through an ingenious technique. Titling the most exposed battery "Men Without Fear," the enterprising officer soon had no shortage of volunteers. Declaring that he only had use for real men, service at the battery soon became a tremendous badge of honour. Volunteers, once scarce, were suddenly abundant. As efforts to construct these batteries continued, Napoleon himself spent considerable time on the front lines. This earned him the respect of both his troops and his superiors. Joining Napoleon was his new secretary, Sergeant Junot. In one account of the siege, the two men were almost hit by a cannonball as Junot was taking Napoleon's dictation for the daily report. With both men suddenly showered in dirt, Junot calmly remarked that he would no longer need sand to blot the ink. But while the mythology of Napoleon the Great was being written at Toulon, the Allies were drafting their own reply. With Allied artillery unable to prevent Napoleon's construction program, it was decided to embrace a more direct methodology. Seeing the noose close around them, in late November, the Allies decided to attack. Concluding that the best defense was a good offense, their goal was to disable the new French batteries to the west of Fort Malbousquet. The instigator of the plan was Major General Charles O'Hara. O'Hara had replaced Lord Mulgrave as commander of British ground forces in late October, and the aggressive officer was a veteran of both the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War. In fact, it's due to the latter that you might recognize his name. At the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, O'Hara was second in command. With the British Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis refusing to personally surrender to George Washington, it was O'Hara who had to do so. Take note of that, as there's some fake history that we will debunk later. Determined to retake the initiative by seizing Napoleon's batteries, the Allies made a surprise attack in the early hours of the 30th of November. Initially, the sortie of about 2,300 troops was successful, driving the French from their new positions just to the west of Fort Malbousquet. However, it's here that things started to fall apart. Replicating the recent French habit of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, three factors turned success into fiasco. Firstly, after routing the French defenders of the battery named La Poudrière, British Major General Dundas decided to push his luck. Although his orders were to hold the position, he decided to move onwards and try to take another battery nearby. Meanwhile, a large contingent of the Allies became distracted, focused on either pursuing the French or pillaging their abandoned camp. Vice Admiral Hood would later liken his men to foxhounds, although I'm unclear if the game was the retreating enemy or their tasty supplies. It's here that we get the fiasco's second component, one that is highly controversial. Two competing narratives retell subsequent events, and both centre on the British commander O'Hara. One version, sympathetic to O'Hara, portrays the Major General as rushing forward in an attempt to unify his splintering forces. This is the depiction by the British historian James Holland Rose, and in presenting O'Hara kindly, the scholar is in the firm minority. The French historian Paul Cottard offers a polar opposite account. Cottard wastes no time in obliterating the imprudent O'Hara, who he accuses of rushing forward in an uncontrollable manner after receiving initial reports of a successful attack. Whatever the case, the foxhounds were soon in flight, as the hunters became the hunted. With the Allies now divided, distracted, and the very definition of incoherent, the French delivered a crushing blow. This was the third component of the Allies' sudden reversal, as French Major General de Gommier rushed from his headquarters at Orlu. Rallying his troops to counter the pre-dawn raid, the French soon inflicted a brilliant and devastating counterattack. No sooner had Major General O'Hara found himself at the front lines had the British leader been shot by the French vanguard. With their outnumbered foe now leaderless and exposed, the French used their superior numbers to mercilessly pursue the enemy. In the commotion that ensued, the French not only drove the Allies back, but subsequently launched multiple assaults on Fort Malbousquet. Only through luck and tremendous efforts did the Allies hold the fort. Thus, what had started as a triumph had almost turned to tragedy. By the time peace returned to the scene, the toll inflicted had been terrible. The ill-fated sortie to silence Bonaparte's batteries had cost the Allies perhaps 400 dead, wounded, or captured. Worse still, that figure included more than a dozen officers, depriving the defence of much-needed leadership. With Hood desperate for fighting personnel, such losses were a serious blow, and the Allies had little to show for it. But before we move on, we should return to the mastermind of this little debacle. Shot in the arm, Major General O'Hara was captured by the French in the midst of the battle. As Napoleon was engaged in the fighting, and performed admirably according to de Gommier, the internet often jumps to some questionable conclusions. If you believe the stories, O'Hara had the unusual distinction of being the only man who personally surrendered to both George Washington and Napoleon Bonaparte. But this is why believing the internet can be a risky affair. Technically, back in 1781, it can be argued that O'Hara hadn't actually surrendered to George Washington himself. When he attempted to do so at Yorktown, Washington recognized that Cornwallis was snubbing him by sending his second-in-command to surrender. Thus, Washington had his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, formally receive Cornwallis's sword, which was presented by O'Hara. Furthermore, despite the claims to the contrary, I don't believe that Napoleon personally accepted O'Hara's surrender. French historian Paul Cottard points out that Bonaparte makes no mention of this in his own memoirs or in his correspondence at the time, nor for that matter do other participants in the battle. Now, do I think that a young and ambitious 24-year-old would omit his personal capture of a seasoned British officer? No, I do not. Nor does historian Paul Cottard. Combined with French soldiers who did attest to capturing the Major General, well, I think we can put this myth to bed. Anyway, I digress. To put it plainly, the 30th of November was a disaster for the Allies. From the loss of more than a dozen officers to the depletion of their much-needed forces, the Allies had attempted to seize the initiative and secured anything but. With Major General Dundas replacing O'Hara as the new commander of British ground forces, the situation in Toulon was increasingly bleak. So bleak that Dundas recommended the unthinkable. In the aftermath of the battle, Dundas advised retreat. Fearing a disorderly withdrawal, the Major General advised Vice Admiral Hood that the Allies should evacuate Toulon while it was still safe to do so. Hood refused. You see, for the ever-optimistic Vice Admiral, hope was still in sufficient supply. While reinforcements had not been as plentiful as anticipated, accepting defeat was not yet a possibility. Even in early December, Hood waited for the arrival of, well, anybody. Be it the Austrians, the Hessians, the British, by now it didn't really matter. So long as they could point and shoot, their presence would be a welcome relief. Certain that someone would come to his aid, the Vice Admiral no doubt drew strength from the wisdom of Little River Band. The Allies would hang on. Help was on the way. Except help wasn't on the way. And it's here, in Hood's final weeks of desperation, that we should return to our conversation at the start of the last episode. As previously discussed, by late 1793, the members of the fractious coalition were obsessed with their own territorial priorities. As revolutionary France clung on for dear life, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Piedmont Sardinia were fixated on profit, not victory. However, the one notable power that we did not discuss was Great Britain, and I teased that the incompetence of London's response would be all the more glaring if we explored it later in the siege. Well, now is the time to be astonished by British ineptitude. When news reached London that Hood had captured Toulon, the reaction of the British government was one of jubilation. Seizing the majority of the French fleet was itself an unprecedented success, but Hood's unexpected triumph could not have been more timely. In the weeks prior, Britain had suffered a humiliating setback at the ill-fated siege of Dunkirk. As historian Jennifer Morey notes, that disastrous expedition had only just collapsed, and the result was calls for ministerial resignations. Humbled on the global stage, the conquest of Toulon and the Mediterranean fleet practically restored Britain's reputation overnight. Yet, for all the celebrations, the capture of Toulon had unforeseen consequences. Most importantly, Toulon's surrender reinforced the prevailing opinion within the British government that victory was near. Watching an enemy consumed by internal division and surrounded by hostile powers, London was increasingly convinced that the Republic's days were numbered. Prime Minister Pitt had already concluded as such in July, when he remarked that it seemed hardly possible that effective resistance could be sustained. The loss of the great Mediterranean arsenal and its fleet merely confirmed this belief. Unfortunately for Vice Admiral Hood, this overly optimistic outlook is vital in understanding Britain's blunderous response to Toulon. With victory all but assured, time was expendable, and reinforcements were hardly seen as an urgent requirement. Furthermore, in such favourable circumstances, Britain could continue its policy of, well, not having a policy, at least when it came to concrete war aims and clear military priorities. Confident in victory, London pursued simultaneous efforts against the Vendée, the Caribbean, and the continent. After all, with the French on the brink of collapse, now was the time to secure bargaining chips for future negotiations. Thus, in the misguided belief that Toulon was in no immediate danger, British resources were consistently deployed elsewhere, precisely when Hood needed them most. But before we see how Britain's misplaced complacency crippled Toulon's defence, I must make one important note. In all fairness to the British cabinet, this complacency wasn't entirely of their own making. Both Vice Admiral Hood and Lord Mulgrave bear some responsibility. In the opening weeks of the siege, both men wrote incredibly optimistic accounts of the situation they were facing. For example, on the 15th of September, Lord Mulgrave, then the commander of British ground forces, wrote a letter to Prime Minister Pitt. Literally in the first sentence, he assures Pitt of the safety of Toulon. Furthermore, he goes on to declare that the only enemy he fears is sickness and fatigue. Alongside such bullish sentiments were reports from Vice Admiral Hood. In early September, Hood also declared his confidence in holding the town, proclaiming he could withstand 1,000 Carteaux. Perhaps this overconfidence was fueled by Carteau's background as a painter, but it is no doubt bolstered by expectations that immediate and substantial aid would arrive from regional allies. Nevertheless, in the wake of their eventual defeat, the hubris of these officers is glaring. Once you combine these near delusional reports with the fact that correspondence took more than 2 weeks to reach London, the result is a dangerous mixture of inaccuracies and delay. Consequently, the British cabinet could remain in its blissful ignorance for far too long, and by the time reality set in, it was already too late. So, going forward, keep in mind that not only was London overconfident of eventual success, but so too were the commanders on the ground. Commanders who were depriving themselves of the very reinforcements they so desperately required, thanks to their unrealistic reports. Having covered this pervasive culture of complacency, we can now turn our attention to the specifics of Britain's military response. By the time London actually heard of Hood's success, it was already the 13th of September. For reference, the French had therefore seized the western town of Orlu, and just days later, Napoleon would establish his first battery on the shores of the inner harbour. After the celebratory champagne, London got to work crafting a response. On the 26th of September, Secretary of War Dundas wrote to Major General O'Hara, who was then stationed in Gibraltar. To be clear, Secretary Henry Dundas was not the same individual as Major General David Dundas, who we've already discussed fighting alongside O'Hara and advising evacuation after O'Hara's capture. Back in late September, Secretary Dundas assigned O'Hara to Toulon and reassured him that help was on the way. According to Dundas, O'Hara could expect the immediate support of 5,000 Hessians. Furthermore, a large part of Gibraltar's garrison was to be dispatched to Toulon alongside the Major General, and 3,000 troops from Ireland would also be deployed shortly. Alone, this was a significant boost to the defence, but the Austrians had also promised a further 5,000 men. Confident of reinforcements, O'Hara sailed for Toulon. No sooner had he left Gibraltar did the good news come to an end. For all the promises of thousands of troops, these commitments proved utterly worthless. The first problem to arise was the arrival of the 5,000 Austrians. As we've already discussed, Vienna's attempts to extract territorial concessions from Piedmont Sardinia meant that these forces never materialized. But, in making the initial promise, Austria had triggered some unexpected consequences. Back when Vienna actually looked likely to deliver its forces, it was concluded that these troops could substitute the 5,000 Hessians which Britain had intended to dispatch. After all, Britain, with its numerous other priorities, might have better use for them elsewhere. The Hessians could be deployed along the Rhine, in the Low Countries, to the Caribbean, or even remain stationary for the home defence. Why ship the Hessians all the way to Toulon when it would be just so much more convenient for the Austrians to hop across from nearby northern Italy? As such, the Hessians remained in England. In itself, the absence of the Hessians was a tremendous blow. But the non-arrival of the Austrians cost the defence a total of 10,000 men. For comparison, at the end of the siege, Allied forces numbered perhaps 16 to 18,000. However, a decent chunk of those were either inexperienced or sickly. So, 10,000 Germanic warriors. That would have been a godsend. But the absence of these experienced soldiers was just problem number one. The second issue to plague British reinforcements stemmed from this persistent culture of complacency. The governor of Gibraltar, a man named Robert Boyd, decided to modify his orders. Although instructed to dispatch as many troops as possible, Boyd considered the situation in Toulon under control. Just like London, the governor was confident in both the defence of the town and victory in the wider war. Furthermore, Boyd was far less confident in the trustworthiness of his new Spanish allies or the harmlessness of the French Atlantic Fleet. Loath to make his position vulnerable for a cause he considered as good as won, the governor dispatched perhaps as few as 750 men. This was half of what Hood had hoped for, and certainly well below what Gibraltar could spare. Additionally, Hood desperately needed officers, engineers, and artillerymen, all of which the Rock could have supplied. Needless to say, the Vice-Admiral was furious to discover that his ships had returned near empty when they arrived back in Toulon in late October. Worse still, Governor Boyd would continue to obstruct future reinforcements, pointing to newspaper reports and other inaccurate accounts which supported his assertion that troops didn't need to be sent. So, no Hessians, no Austrians, and far too few reinforcements from Gibraltar. As a result, I'm sure it will come as no surprise to discover that those 3,000 troops promised from Ireland, yes, you guessed it, they too were missing in action. Overconfident and distracted by plans in the Vendée, the Caribbean, and elsewhere on the continent, the divided attention of Britain crippled its own defence. Thus, for all the hope Hood had placed in sudden and substantial reinforcement, his own nation was just as useless as the other ineffectual allies. But, up until now, you could argue that Britain's response was misguided. Things were mishandled, poor judgments were made. Mistakes, while unfortunate, were bound to happen. Combined with overly optimistic reports and difficulties in communications, can we really give London such a hard time? Well, yes, because I've saved the best till last. Distracted by the possibilities of enriching itself in the Caribbean, at the start of October, the Admiralty had a brilliant idea. Why not withdraw troops from Toulon and send them to seize French colonies elsewhere? As such, on the 26th of October, Hood received orders instructing him to return the soldiers of the 30th Regiment. These were the Army's men who had been serving in place of Marines on several of Hood's vessels. Now, to be fair to the Admiralty, Hood and Mulgrave had been reporting overly optimistic accounts of the campaign in the first weeks of September. Had they not been doing so, the Admiralty probably wouldn't be withdrawing troops come October. But, rose-coloured reports aside, this was still a terrible judgment on the part of British officials. To divide Hood's forces for colonial conquest and to fail to anticipate French efforts to retake the town, those are two inexcusable blunders. As historian James Holland Rose notes, however tempting the offers of French royalists were to collaborate with Britain to secure the Caribbean, Toulon was the last place in which to deplete troops. By the time Hood received these orders in late October, the Vice-Admiral was deeply distressed. Toulon's defenders stalled for time, conveniently aided by the absence of one of the necessary vessels to transport the men. Consequently, it wasn't until the 21st of November that Rear Admiral Gell departed Toulon with hundreds of troops. Worse still, he was departing with multiple vessels, whose guns and crews could have also aided the defence. So, just as Napoleon's batteries were enclosing on both Fort Mulgrave and Fort Malbousquet in late November, the British were, oh, that's right, depleting their already insufficient forces for territorial escapades in the Caribbean. Thankfully, by the time Rear Admiral Gell reached Gibraltar on the 30th of November, new orders had arrived from London. With the Admiralty suddenly alert to Toulon's desperate situation, the Caribbean cruise was cancelled. But the comedy of errors was not. Told to return to Toulon immediately, the squadron did anything but. 10 precious days were wasted in Gibraltar as much-needed soldiers twiddled their thumbs. The reason for this has never been clearly identified. Perhaps the delay was caused by the fact that some vessels didn't reach Gibraltar until the 5th of December. However, eyewitnesses assert that there were sufficient ships for an initial convoy to return to Toulon, and time was of the essence. Furthermore, most of the French Mediterranean fleet was in Allied hands, so it's not like the convoy needed to be large in the first place. Whatever the reasons, further delays struck the convoy upon leaving Gibraltar, due to the slowness of one particular vessel. Consequently, by the time Rear Admiral Gell returned to Toulon, the town had already fallen. To add insult to injury, while Gell's Caribbean adventure had been halted, others had been permitted to continue, demonstrating the sheer absurdity of Britain's ill-defined war aims. Some 7,000 men had departed England in late November, destined for the West Indies. Thus, even in the final weeks of the Toulon campaign, as it claimed to be doing its utmost to aid the besieged, London's attention was divided. Historian James Holland Rose holds nothing back as he evaluates this farcical situation. It is difficult to conceive a more fatal series of blunders than those which are here described. The resolve to withdraw troops from Toulon, and then to send them back again, the delay in shipping them piecemeal from that port, their straggling arrival at Gibraltar, the leisurely arrangements for their return, and the clogging of the squadron by a wretched little lame duck, involved discredit on everyone concerned. The results of these fatuities was that the St. George and Leviathan were detained at Gibraltar, and 4 sail of the line, with 2 regiments on board, were crawling back to Toulon, while the fate of that stronghold was being decided by a genius who knew the value of time and concentration of energy. I don't know about you, but I can feel the patriotic anger seething in those lines. And to be frank, I think it's entirely understandable. Having gambled that all of Europe would rally to his defence, not even England would answer Hood's call for aid. Thanks to a mixture of mismanagement and complacency, British reinforcements were ultimately pitiful. By the time the siege ended in mid-December, the King's men had increased by just a few hundred in total. That is simply extraordinary for a 16-week campaign in which Britain had mastery of the seas. Having once predicted a deluge of men and supplies, I think Hood could be forgiven for being a little disappointed. Yet, somehow, even in early December, as Major General Dundas advised evacuation, Hood continued to hope. Believing that Allied governments couldn't possibly abandon him, the permanent optimist was determined to hang on until the end. Unfortunately for Hood, that end was increasingly near. In the aftermath of the disastrous sortie of 30 November, the Allies would never again regain the initiative. With French forces eventually numbering almost 40,000, the defenders of Toulon were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. However, for all the progress of the siege, things were hardly sunshine and rainbows for the Republican besiegers. Thanks to a multitude of factors, Dugommier had to act. Appreciating a fact that was seemingly lost on the British, time was of the essence. Hunger stalked his army, while his enemy were likely to be reinforced. Combined with the personal risks of failure, the French had no choice but to advance. In the first fortnight of December, Dugommier called 2 councils of war, in which he reconfirmed his plan from late November. Reflective of Bonaparte's original vision, the Republicans would seize Toulon's heights by making 2 simultaneous assaults on Fort Mulgrave and Mount Ferron. These engagements would be matched with diversionary bombardments on Fort Malbousquet, Cape Bras, and Toulon itself. With attacks from the west, north, and east, the Allies would be overwhelmed. The final push commenced on the evening of the 16th of December. Fort Mulgrave had been bombarded for days by Napoleon's batteries, and troops were now marshalled in nearby Le Seine for the grand assault. As the French prepared to conquer what they called Little Gibraltar, the task ahead of them was a daunting one. Although Fort Mulgrave had been cannonaded for days, the entrenched positions remained considerable obstacles. So too was the weather. Night assaults are famously difficult, but in the early hours of the 17th, the heavens were letting loose. The storm which consumed Toulon was no less violent than the struggle to come, and thick fog obscured the moon, the enemy, and one's own allies. Nonetheless, the French advanced. Ascending through spontaneous streams which were running off the heights, the drenched Republicans launched their daring assault. Even before contact was made with the Allies, Dugommier's plans were crumbling. In the disorientating darkness, 2 of his 3 columns had accidentally merged. Amongst the 7,000-odd assailants, perhaps as many as 4,000 were conscripts, and their inexperience showed. Cries of betrayal dogged the panicky French, and fear proved almost as deadly as the Allied response. However, despite these difficulties, the French continued and found initial success. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Victor, a future Napoleonic marshal, 2 key outworks were successfully seized. Blood poured alongside the rain as the defenders were cut to pieces. Although the resistance was stubborn, the sheer number of French troops ultimately proved unstoppable. Well, until they were. The northernmost redoubt, named St. Louis, abruptly paralysed French momentum. Allied troops within were determined to hold the line, and the French began to waver. After 3 unsuccessful assaults and the wounding of Victor himself, disaster seemed dangerously close. Defeat was moments away. It was now that Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte made his appearance. Commanding the reserves, which consisted primarily of National Guardsmen, Napoleon entered the fray. It is unclear if Dugommier had ordered this himself, or if Napoleon had done so on his own initiative. Either way, the arrival of the French reserves doomed the Allied defence. Before long, most of the outer works were seized, and Little Gibraltar was soon to follow. Napoleon himself was one of the first to enter the fort. In a frantic attempt to maintain their stronghold, a British counterattack was conducted with a mixture of soldiers, marines, and naval gunners. Engaging Napoleon and his small vanguard almost immediately, the fighting, which was still occurring in darkness, was fierce, bloody, and merciless. It's here, amongst the chaos, that it can be argued that Napoleon came closest to death in combat. Holding the fort until reinforcements ascended the heights, Napoleon was stabbed in the leg by an enemy combatant. Napoleon's injury proved to be relatively minor, but his own bloodshed was nonetheless advantageous for the mythology of his triumph. However, it is indeed worth pondering how history might have been extraordinarily different had that wound been fatal. As the French reserves poured into Fort Mulgrave, the defence was lost. Allied reinforcements were either already spent or, rather controversially, unwilling to enter a struggle they seemed certain to lose. And that last point is key. The inaction of some nearby Spanish and Neapolitan troops remains the source of bitter debate. For example, British Captain Edward Cook lampooned his coalition partners for their performance on the 17th, blaming them for the loss of Fort Mulgrave. Writing the day after Toulon's evacuation, Cook condemned the Spanish for failing to hold the third outer redoubt, retreating from their position too early. Adding to this criticism is the common perspective that another nearby Spanish outpost could have lent some much-needed assistance, but instead stayed out of the fight. Furthermore, Cook also chastises the Neapolitans. In one of the most amusing lines of the siege, Cook unloads on their officers in particular, accusing them of being the greatest cowards to have ever shouldered a rifle. However, these accounts from a British officer seem to blame everyone but the British. And that's the point. These accusations of ineptitude and cowardice actually go both ways. You just need to read other sources. Spanish accounts are no less flattering of British conduct, and indeed some neutral historians praise certain Spanish units for their performance against overwhelming odds. Likewise, while it's true that the Neapolitan reinforcements did not engage in the final push to retake the fort, it's argued by a few scholars that they were nonetheless critical in protecting the successful evacuation of the western side of the inner harbour. So, what we have here is dramatically different portrayals of the loss of Little Gibraltar, and these contradictory accounts are reflective of the fact that both contemporaries and historians were no doubt deliberately recording history in a way to flatter one's own conduct. After all, why take responsibility for the loss of a battle when you can pin it on your unreliable allies? Speaking of, it's also important to note that within just a few short years, Spain and Britain would return to their usual status as enemies, and the end of their unholy alliance also distorts accounts of the siege. But before we move on, I do want to explore one other example of self-serving reporting. Not only do contradictory accounts exist regarding the defence of Fort Mulgrave, but so too do differing perspectives of the fort itself. For example, some French sources paint Fort Mulgrave as a Mediterranean Mount Doom. These were grand heights, consumed by darkness, fire, and an unforgiving and merciless enemy. With at least one British soldier probably looking like a cousin of Smeagol, it's easy to see the conquest of Little Gibraltar as a heroic feat accomplished against the odds. Indeed, French victory is portrayed as just that, a minor miracle and one that was far from a foregone conclusion. But English perspectives depict something altogether different, and believe it or not, they don't even focus on the fact that this miracle was predicated on a numerical advantage of almost 3-1. Instead, British sources depict a spectacularly inadequate defence, with no shortage of deficiencies. Far from an impregnable bastion, it is routinely highlighted that the Allies lacked experienced engineers to plan, construct, and fortify key positions. Historian James Holland Rose goes as far as to describe Fort Mulgrave as designed by amateurs. Lacking a systematic plan, the position had been mutilated by bombardment from Napoleon's batteries, and the fort itself was insufficiently armed to protect its multiple vulnerabilities. Backing up this assertion is the contemporary report of the Piedmontese commander, recording his experience of the days-long barrage which softened the fortification. It's important to note the criticality and relentlessness of Napoleon's artillery. The fire was continuous and so violent that up to 7 bombs were being fired at once. The cannonade was violent. Everything was at stake. The daily loss was heavy and the troops exhausted with fatigue. A continuous fire from 5 batteries of cannon and mortars had lasted for 3 days and 3 nights against the works. The defences had been badly damaged by the enemy fire. If such depictions are accurate, then the mythology of Little Gibraltar could not have stacked up to reality. However, once again, these portrayals, by a British historian and a Piedmontese officer, may just be retroactive justifications for losing the fort. In short, almost every aspect of Little Gibraltar, from its demise to its design, remains ambiguous. It remains grey history. Yet, even as the Allies evacuated their men from the beaches behind Fort Mulgrave, the situation was getting worse. To the north, the French had once again scaled the near impassable heights of Mount Ferron. Benefiting from both clever manoeuvres and a substantial numerical advantage, the mountain, which overshadowed Toulon, was soon swarming with French troops. Isolated pockets of resistance remained, but their ongoing defiance was hardly sustainable. Thus, Daugomier's plan had worked. Through diversionary bombardments and coordinated assaults, the French had seized the heights. Both the forts of the inner harbour and Mount Ferron itself had fallen into Republican hands. Now, given what I have just said, you may think to yourself, surely the gig was up. Given that most of this siege has revolved around who controlled the heights, their loss was no doubt fatal to the Allied cause. Well, that is indeed the conclusion of most of the Allied leadership, but not all. Somehow, even now, the ever-optimistic Vice Admiral Hood wanted to hang on. In a hastily assembled council of war on the morning of the 17th of December, Hood made the case for continued resistance. Yes, Little Gibraltar was lost. Yes, Mount Ferron was lost. But hope? Well, that remained alive and well. Critically, news had reached Toulon that reinforcements were on the way. Troops from Gibraltar could arrive at any moment, while the Austrians had confirmed that their long-promised soldiers were finally on the move. In reality, neither were anywhere near Toulon, but Hood made the case for prolonging the siege. Luckily for the Vice Admiral, his fellow officers said no. Major General Dundas, commander of British ground forces, had already been advising evacuation since the end of November. Joining him was a chorus of senior officers from Naples, Piedmont, Sardinia, and most importantly, Spain. Collectively, they argued that retaining Toulon was now impossible and that the evacuation must commence. Throughout the tense discussions, Brigadier General Tom de Revel made a personal appeal to Hood. Revel was the commander of the Piedmontese, and he implored Hood to withdraw. Seeking to lessen the humiliating loss, Revel remarked, "My lord, all Europe knows that it was you who took Toulon, but nobody can accuse you of having lost it." Indeed, Toulon was lost, and Hood finally accepted it. Quickly adopting a plan for evacuation, the Allies agreed on a staged withdrawal. Over the next 2 days, they achieved just that. By the morning of the 19th, more than 48 hours after the French assault on Fort Mulgrave, the Allies had departed Toulon. French inaction, perhaps due to inexperience, perhaps due to exhaustion, perhaps due to certainty of victory, greatly aided the successful departure. However, as the Allies sailed away from the shores of Toulon, their final hours would prove incredibly contentious. In the disorder which consumed the frantic departure, historians and contemporaries tend to focus on completely different aspects of the evacuation. Combined with the bloody reoccupation of Toulon by the victorious Jacobins, these final stages of the siege are defined by three considerable controversies. Firstly, there is the evacuation itself. Allied accounts generally portray a successful endeavour, one which saved not only the defenders themselves, but also thousands of the town's residents. Indeed, after months of rebellion against the Convention, many French citizens wished to avoid the vengeance of the triumphant Jacobins. But as thousands swarmed the dockyards in a desperate attempt to secure safe passage, the resulting anarchy was all too predictable. British accounts of the events are relatively positive, although one official grimly wrote that history had seldom seen more misery and terror in such a short space. Such descriptions align with the perspectives of French historians such as Thiers and Cottard, who are unrelenting in their criticisms of these events. To be frank, it's easy to see why. From mass drownings to Allied troops firing upon boats full of civilians, the controversies are considerable. Ultimately, perhaps more than 7,000 civilians successfully escaped the Republic's wrath, but many corpses were left behind. Secondly, in addition to the disorderly evacuation of French civilians, much controversy surrounds the decision to burn the French fleet. Further debate rages as to Allied inability to actually accomplish this task. For all the celebrations of Britain's successful seizure of the Mediterranean fleet, the end result was hardly worth cheering. Less than half of French ships of the line were permanently destroyed or captured, and that number decreases if you include non-operational vessels. Once again, accounts by British and Spanish sources are full of contradictions and accusations, but one element is beyond any doubt. The Allies failed miserably in neutralising the Republic's navy. This incompetence had considerable costs. Finally, in a nice change of pace, the last major controversy of the end of the siege actually centres on the French. As the Republicans reclaimed the royalist town, well, you can imagine what came next. In Lyon, we saw mass executions by cannon, and at least Lyon hadn't openly embraced either the monarchy or the British. Consequently, mass shootings were quick to follow. As the deputy Paul Barras remarked, nothing can save Toulon from national vengeance. In total, perhaps as many as 1,000 died in the terror, the vast majority civilians without trial. Now, all three of these events are dripping in controversy, and to explore each of them properly would require three significant digressions from what is already a significant episode. As such, these bloody controversies are the focus of not one, not two, but three separate episode extras for this episode. with accusations of Allied troops firing upon boats full of refugees, to the chaotic execution of hundreds, to the unforeseen consequences for Napoleon's campaign to Egypt, there is so much to unpack. As a result, make sure not to miss it. As always, you can enjoy this and other unbelievable bonus content by helping to support the creation of Grey History. Become a member of the show's community and secure your next conquest of the amazing ambiguities and nuances of the French Revolution. Without your support, I might have to evacuate back into a corporate job, and the consequences for your ongoing enjoyment of the revolution would be deadlier than Napoleon's artillery. So follow the link in the show notes or on the website and help produce history that isn't black and white. You can cancel anytime, and with 3 episode extras for you to enjoy right now for this episode alone, well, what could you possibly be waiting for? Please support Grey History today. With the Allies forced to abandon Toulon, the French Republic had achieved an almighty success. Not only had a royalist foothold been vanquished from French soil, but the embattled revolutionaries had struck a blow against both the monarchy in exile and the collective crowns of Europe. Yet, in retaking the rogue port of Toulon, the Jacobin Convention had accomplished so much more than a mere military victory. It had crushed the last bastion of the Federalist revolts. With the majority of the country now pacified and much of the Girondin leadership executed, by the end of 1793, the Jacobins were the uncontested masters of the revolutionary project. They would be the authors of a rejuvenated France. They would be the custodians of the new, virtuous republic. Or at least, that was the plan. Unfortunately for the Mountain, new factions would soon emerge. Once more, friends became foes, and blood continued to flow. But while Toulon was a victory for the Republic, it was a triumph for one Republican in particular. Ever since his arrival in September 1793, Napoleon had shaped every aspect of the siege. Despite his inexperience, the young officer had transformed not only his career, but both the campaign and the wider war. Through tenacity, energy, and a relentless pursuit of his vision, Napoleon had done the unthinkable. Napoleon, more than anyone else, had retaken Toulon. His contemporaries took note. The praise for his aptitude, his conduct, his bravery is nearly endless. And this isn't just imperial propaganda. Letters from the time lionize the future emperor. Having played critical roles in multiple engagements, and having been wounded in the final struggle, there was much to commend and much to admire. In short, Napoleon had undeniably triumphed. Promoted to the rank of Brigadier General on the 22nd of December, this untested captain had revolutionized himself into a celebrated tactician. His first success was brilliant, visionary, and absolute. It was also the first of many. Thank you for listening to episode 73, Napoleon's Triumph. There are 3 amazing episode extras for this episode, exploring the various controversies of the Toulon campaign, from the mass execution of civilians to Allied troops firing upon refugees. There's so much to unpack, and you absolutely don't want to miss it. To enjoy this and other amazing bonus content, not to mention a whole bunch of other perks, please do your part to create history that isn't black and white. By donating half a cup of coffee when main narrative episodes are released, you can help ensure that Grey History is waiting for you tomorrow. And in fact, those members on the True Revolutionary tier will already have access to episode 74, The Constitution of 1793. One final welcome to the newest members of the community, and a special shout out again to the amazingly generous heroes of the revolution: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Auger, Kevin, Scott, Howard, Fernando, Gilberto, and Ron. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.